Welcome to New York Bio's virtual breakfast series, a digital program started in 2020, bringing you fireside chats with leaders from across the healthcare spectrum. This week's episode features Orin Herskowitz, Senior Vice President of Intellectual Property and Tech Transfer for Columbia University, as well as the Executive Director of Columbia's Technology Ventures. He's also an adjunct professor of Columbia's Business School and has had a huge impact of the development of the bioscience industry within New York City.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Jennifer Hawks-Bland, and I'm the CEO at New York Bio. We're thrilled that you're joining us today for our virtual breakfast series. It's hard to believe and not hard to believe that it's September 1st. So thank you again to Goodwin Procter, who has been our sponsor for the past 2 months. And we are welcoming our new sponsor, TriNet, which is an HR solutions company. They will be sponsoring us for September and October as we bring very interesting guests, just like Orin today, to you to discuss all things biotech in New York and elsewhere. A few housekeeping things. I sometimes forget to mention this. Don't forget, we will be taking your questions and providing some answers. You can use your chat feature or the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom webinar screen. And please join us in 2 weeks, actually 2 weeks from this morning, just at this time. You're used to joining us for our virtual breakfast, so plan to join us for the New York Bio annual meeting. It will be split into 2 days this year, so 2 morning sessions, and it'll be virtual, so right here in your home with your very own coffee, just as you're used to on Tuesday mornings. With that, thank you again for joining us, and I'll flip it over to Derek to introduce our esteemed guests.
All right, Jennifer, thank you so much. So Orin, it's a pleasure to have you here.
Good to be here.
It's funny when we were thinking of, new guests and things like that, you've been on my list for a while because in an interesting twist, you moved to Columbia about the same time that I landed in New York. So, we have kind of basically the same exact time scale to look at, academic and biopharma in interactions within New York City's ecosystem. So we usually start these with a little bit of an origin story, and I'm interested in yours because you basically stepped into Columbia's tech transfer office, straight out of BCG. You were there for a number of years, but that's not really the typical way that anybody kind of enters that, it's not really the typical way that anybody actually enters tech transfer or academic commercialization. So how did that happen?
Sure, I will. I also did want to, you mentioned Goodwin Procter. I did want to say I was not asked to do this plug, but we've worked with Steve Davis and the team at Goodwin Procter for many, many years now. And in fact, we work with many law firms in New York, but we also try to find firms that we think work very well with startups and try to refer our startups to them as much as possible because it makes the interaction so much easier. We'll probably talk about that later on. But when we're working with new entrepreneurs or even smaller scale VCs, they often just don't know their way around a university licensing agreement, which those of you who have seen one, they're kind of a nightmare. And so there's a handful of firms that we recommend on our website, and Steve Davis and his team at Goodwin Procter have been amazing. And I say that even though they've been negotiating against us on all these deals.
That is the highest compliment.
That is a high bar indeed. So many thanks, Steve, for helping to steer the startups in the right path. Derek, Jennifer, thanks for inviting me. I appreciate it. Yeah, no, it's interesting. I've mentioned this before, but I'm an English major with an MBA. I have no science background. I have no law background. And so this really was a bit of an odd path. So I was at BCG from 1999 to 2005 and absolutely loved it. I mean, it was great. There was big ambiguous questions, mostly not all, but important questions for companies. And what I liked about it was definitely analytical in the sense that there was some analysis you could do, but these were, unlike certain types of problems, this wasn't math problems. There was no right answer. It's all about sort of big ambiguous questions where you do the analysis you can, and then you've got to say good enough and commit. And then, so, people think of these as strategy firms. So the Boston Consulting Group describes itself as a strategy firm. It's really about strategy and execution. And in the execution part, there's actually getting the work done, but there's also learning how to manage stakeholders and structure meetings and sort of bring stakeholders together to a common outcome. And so all of that was really good to learn. And I think came in really handy for tech transfer work. In many ways, it's similar. Like we're not, even though each of the 400 inventions we get a year are based in deep science, the science is so deep that frankly, it's not really clear what the right answer is or not. Like, will it work? If it does work, is it going to be useful? If it's useful, is it going to actually, not cause harm along the way? Will it fit into an industry's roadmap for the future? Most of these fail, but the ones that we're a reverse black swan business. So like most of these fail, but the ones that don't fail are massively, massively successful. And so you could spend your entire days analyzing 5 of the 400 inventions a year and never get anything done. So the team really has to make these kinds of good enough and commit decisions constantly, and then just execute and get stuff done. So yeah, it was really, really good training. I was there for 2 years. I'm sorry, I was there for 6 years. I intended to stay for 2. And honestly, I probably should have stayed for 2. The advice I give people going into consulting now is write yourself a note about how long you want to stay, and then don't stay longer.
Yeah.
But the bar was high. It was really fun. So I was like, bar was high for looking for something else to do. I was exploring a bunch of different things. And then honestly, I've got to be honest, like people like a career arc. This was not a career arc moment. I was in my office, and my office mate, Christophe Durand, who's in the pharma practice at BCG, got a phone call from Spencer Stewart recruiting him for the chief operating officer role at CTV. He was not even vaguely interested. And so he literally passed the phone to me.
No, here, talk to this
That's
guy.
awesome. Hey, got that.
Yeah. I mean, it was definitely a like check one's privilege moment because I was in the right place at the right time. And I had no knowledge of the tech transfer world except for a case I'd just gotten off of from Mayor Bloomberg, which I can talk about later if we want, but about whether New York City could become a biotech capital. This was back in 2004 or 5, late 2004. And so, I never would have been hired for the top job at CTV. I never would have been hired for executive director without a science background. I couldn't have done a licensing officer job. I wouldn't have been hired for an entry-level role. But what they were looking for was the chief operating officer role. And so they were really, CTV, Columbia had always been very, very successful in terms of amazing outcomes. But it had grown organically over the years. And so the processes, just the basic, engine oil stuff was a little bit messy. And so that's what I was hired for. And it was, a couple of things broke my way. The first is universities. It's incredible. I got incredibly lucky that that universities are very open about sharing with each other. Unlike the corporate world, when you start at GE, you can't call Corning and Dow and so how do you do this?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so in biopharma, I think my observation is that people move jobs so much that there's a little bit of that because everyone who's worked at Merck used to work at Pfizer and
Yeah.
GSK.
Yeah, GSK, exactly.
Yeah.
But I was able to just call my peers and just, so I spent the first 6 months just on a road, basically just talking to MIT and Stanford and Penn and Cornell and Yale and Harvard and Caltech and just saying like, how do you do this? And I think this is a long answer to a short question, but I'll wrap up in a minute. I think that led to sort of a few different MOs that we've really stuck with over the years. The first is benchmark everywhere you can and import every idea you can. I think there's a risk that you fall prey to not invented here. But if you are in an industry where you can find out how your peers do things and work with them, and then sort of, you always have to adapt and scale things. You've got to make sure the wheels you're bringing in fit the car you're driving. But you can adapt and scale it to work at Columbia. And since Columbia is very generous with resources around these topics, it's actually been relatively easy to do. And the second is that we always have dozens of experiments running. So we have like tons of new initiatives that we're trying all the time to try and make sure that we can sort of maximize around our key objectives. And just like our portfolio of science, most of those initiatives won't work. Some of them will work pretty well, and then a few of them will be really transformative. And so we just kill off the ones that don't work and keep adding new ones. And it's led to a whole bunch of really interesting innovations around the office. I'll also note, sorry, I should note, I could never do this without the team at Columbia. We have an amazingly talented and stable group in our office that have been there for, in some cases, 20, 30 years, and they make the job really easy.
Well, it's interesting. So when you first stepped in the door, right, you obviously you have certain advantages. That probably has to be one, although that's probably a bit of a challenge, right? If you step in the door and you have people that have been there for a long time and there's stuff that has to change, right? There's some people that tend to be intractable to that. So what were some of the things that you kind of noticed at first? Were there certain things that were stronger than other things? Were there certain areas where you gravitated towards this is actually running smoothly and this is a mess? Right? What were some of the things like that? And just to put things into context for the people here, so Columbia has expertise in any one of a number of different segments. And correct me if I'm wrong, the hospital is separate from the actual academic campus in terms of an entity, right? From IP generation.
That is an incredibly complicated question to answer on a webinar. But
we have time. We have time. It's early in the hour.
Start, Orin.
We also have several more questions. So.
Exactly.
Venn diagram.
You guys all settle in, get your coffee, maybe a whiskey, and we'll keep. No, it's actually not that bad. The Columbia, our office represents the entire Columbia. Anyone with a Columbia appointment is represented by our office. Typically, what that means is that all of the research labs and PhD students and postdocs at the university are represented by our office.
Okay.
We do actually work really closely with New York Presbyterian. In fact, we do a lot of their tech transfer for them. But what that means is typically it's like residents or their technical staff where IP is generated. The docs at NYP all have Columbia appointments.
Okay.
But I don't think that was your primary question.
That wasn't the first part of the question.
Okay.
The first part was we can simplify it and streamline it. What was working really well and what was broken and needed to get fixed?
Yeah, I mean, so I think that's a good question. So we've always had our licensing staff at Columbia has been amazing. We've got folks, there's folks like Sarah Gussick and Jerry Kokoschka, Ron Katz, who have just, Cindy Lang, who've been around for a really long time, know the faculty, and many, many more. I'm just, obviously Afra, who runs the team, Afra Weinberger, who know the faculty inside and out, know all of the scientists going on, are scientists themselves, and so bring technical expertise to the table, but have also at this point, we do about 120 license agreements a year. So over the last 10 years, that's over 1,000 agreements that have been done by our office. And so the team is just deeply experienced at getting this done. So the licensing side, honestly, was working really well. The rest of the office was also working really well. What I think what we've tried to do over the last sort of 10 to 15 years is really systematize things. So try to bring things out of just one person's head and record them somewhere, turn them into an SOP that we can follow day in and day out. We have an amazing team of contracts experts who are great at getting things like material. I mean, these, everyone talks about, applied therapeutics or Calliope, but what you don't realize is universities, we might do 100 license agreements a year, but we do thousands of material transfer agreements a year. And you want to see an angry faculty member delay that antibody they need for a day. So yeah. You could have just done a $10 million deal for them, but you slow down that confidentiality agreement they need to go talk at a panel and you're toast. And so some of this is really just as I mentioned before, it's just the engine oil. It's just getting stuff done. Overall at Columbia, I would say, it's interesting when I joined Columbia, and this is, I think, true for most universities. When I joined Columbia, I at least had a misconception about the way universities work, that that you could say something like, what's Columbia good at, or what does Columbia want? And so saying what does Columbia want is really like saying what does New York want, or what does America want? It's at best, I think we sometimes use the federalist model of, the federalist analogy of like, it's a collection of states that usually work in each other's advantage, but are also self-motivated. Someone also described it as a coral reef, which I think is a sort of a nice analogy. With all sorts of organisms that are kind of all trying to survive, but maybe work in a symbiotic way. but I think you have seen, so a lot of what we've tried to do over the years is Columbia is an amazing institution with great leadership at the president level, at the deans, department chairs, the center directors. But one of the things we've tried to do in partnership with others on the university is just get everyone rowing in the same direction around the topics of commercialization and in particular entrepreneurship. So there's always been support for entrepreneurship on campus in pockets, but over the last 5 or 7 years, you've really seen more resources from the schools, from the deans, at the department level, from our office, from our peers at Columbia Entrepreneurship, from the president. And you can see the outcomes of that because we've gone from 5 IP-backed startups a year when I joined to 20 to 30 a year these days. So it really has been just an explosion of startups, an explosion of resources to support those startups over the years.
Well, this is good because this feeds into a few of the other things that I mentioned. So I remember being in these, panels about, how is New York going to be a better biocluster? We ran a number of these focus groups when I was at the New York Academy of Sciences, right? And there was always this general consensus where somebody would say, well, the institutions in New York out-license their technology to big companies, and in Boston and San Francisco, they start companies, right? And this is going back 15, 20 years, but that was the general consensus on the attitude of academia within New York City versus, Boston and San Francisco. I imagine there's probably, both a little bit of myth and a little bit of truth to that sentiment. Did you see any of that when you stepped in?
So that's so funny. I'm laughing because I mentioned this earlier, but when I was at BCG, I did the project for Mayor Bloomberg's administration. It was essentially, the title was what would you have to believe that New York could beat Boston in 20 years? In terms of biotech, obviously, no other way would we want to emulate that city. No offense to Boston.
No, none of that.
New York proud.
The Bruins lost last night. Good riddance.
But my first day on the case, so I'm like this wet behind the ears consultant who's like, just like, oh, sure, biotech, I'll go look that up, and then I'll look up, what a tech transfer office is. So the team at the EDC says the challenge is that the institutions in New York don't license to startups; they want to license to industry. Go talk to people and figure out if that's true. And so I go. I don't know those of you who know Kathleen Dennis, who ran Rockefeller for like 50 years. And so I went to Kathleen and like my first interview, and I was like, so Kathleen, how come you don't like startups and instead like industry? And I got my head ripped off. So I actually do think it's a real misconception. I mean, even back then, and it's not even true anymore, but even back then, it's a misconception for a few different reasons. And I think those are important important to understand for the dynamics of the industry. First of all, especially back then, less so now, but especially back then, it was incredibly rare that we would have, first of all, it's incredibly rare that you even have one party interested in licensing your technology. Right. It is astronomically rare that you have 2 people at the same time interested in licensing your technologies. So, our mission, like the mission at Columbia, is move technologies from the lab bench to the market for the benefit of society. Full stop. So if I'm sitting with a technology on the shelf and a company comes along and says, I'd like to license it, and I don't have anyone else to license it to, I'm going to figure out a way to make that work. Because we always include diligence terms in our agreements so that we'll get the technology back if the license doesn't progress.
Right.
So back then, I mean, Derek, you were around, like, how many biotech startups were launching in New York City every year?
Not many.
Right. How many seasoned entrepreneurs in biotech were there launching those startups? How many VC firms did we have launching those startups? So there just weren't that many startups to license to. And if you did have a faculty member who had startup dreams, there wasn't venture funding for them. There wasn't space for them to go into. There weren't mentors and advisors for them to connect to as much. So there just wasn't that many startups. And there's been huge shifts since then. Columbia, New York City, across the nation. I mean, it's like, first of all, most notably, there's been an explosion of deep tech startups. So, and this wasn't Columbia's doing. I'm not taking credit for that. Just across the country, and in New York City, there was a huge, so there was like pull and push. On the pull side, there was a huge boom for biotech VCs. Not only, the VCs that were in the game did extraordinarily well. It was a bull market for biotech stocks and for M&A. It drew more VC capital into it. So there's a lot more funding. The Obama administration, the governor, the former mayor Bloomberg, and even de Blasio now are pushing startups as a savior for America. There's more incubators and accelerators, so there's more places for these startups to land. And then internally at the universities, there's been a groundswell of interest from the faculty, from the deans, from the president, to push startups. The alumni are interested in it. Everyone's talking startups. So it's been a big uptick in the number of startups. And the other half of the equation, and this gets to I think the perception that we used to prefer biopharma licensing, and that's why it was tough. Biopharma changed. And Jennifer, I think I'm interested in sort of your view on this too, but at least the perception from industry is that the biopharma industry used to go looking for patents to license and then develop the R&D in-house. And increasingly, maybe a little, I'll come back to this because there's maybe a little bit of a switchback recently, but until recently, pharma kind of decided they liked their innovation medium well, not rare. And seem like they're perfectly happy to let these things go into startups. Maybe their venture arms will invest directly. Maybe they'll become LPs in the venture firms, but they'd rather let that stuff cook somewhere else and just get it on a plate in a much more expensive.
Right? Yeah.
So I don't know if you've seen that too. That's certainly been our perception.
Yeah, I think you have a couple of things. I think one, as you had more startups, then I think that also enabled pharma companies to have a broader range from which to choose. It didn't have to choose quite as early, right? It could wait and see how they developed. And like you said, maybe their venture arms, which definitely matured over the last 10 to 15 years, right? Looked at strategic investments. So I think it was a combination, which is good, right? Because that means we're building a whole ecosystem, not just
great.
one sliver of it, right? We've got these pillars. We actually did have a couple of, speaking of startups, I don't want to miss questions when they're timely. We had a couple of IP equity comments or questions. One is how Columbia treats equity when you do startups and how you take equity if you do. Sure. And the other one is how you educate faculty, postdoc students about IP and how to translate their research into actual, therapeutics later.
Absolutely. And that's perfect. Don't give me more than 2 questions at a time because my memory is incredibly bad. So actually, before we move off that, I did want to comment though, because we work really closely with a lot of pharma companies. And so I did say until recently, and the reason I mentioned that is at least at Columbia, we are starting to see what may be a return of interest in the early stage stuff. So you've always had like the Sanofi I Awards and Pfizer CTI, and those are fantastic programs. But what we're also now seeing is more pharma companies creating like deep partnerships with a handful of schools. So we have our Sumitomo Boston Biomedical Alliance at Columbia, where we're running an RFP for them every year for innovative therapeutics that they might want to work on. We have something similar with Takeda, which we announced recently. And then just recently, in the last couple of days, you saw Genentech partnered with Princeton and AbbVie with Harvard. Yeah. So I'm wondering whether we're starting to see big pharma, at least some of them, experiment more with creating these like, super early stage, like crawl around the lab, look in test tubes, like early stage, like even earlier than VCs go. And so you may end up with a barbell strategy where they're like at the very beginning crawling around the labs and then buying startups. I don't see a return of the like, show me your patents, I'd like to license them. You asked it, Jennifer, tell me the two. One was about equity. How do we handle equity? Right?
How do you handle equity, and then how do you educate your faculty, postdocs, everyone on how you deal with IP and how they should look at IP?
Sure, sounds great. The last one is actually a setup. I mean, I didn't set it up, but it's perfect because we're very fortunate at Columbia to have Jeff Sears as our chief patent counsel. Jeff is an outstanding patent attorney. He also is on the Public Patent Advisory Committee, which is a group of about 8, I think. 8 individuals who advise the head of the USPTO, Andre Ancu, on patent strategy. So he's a phenomenal. So he and I have taught a class at Columbia for the last decade called IP for Entrepreneurs. And it is essentially, it's a 6-week class, 2.5 hours a session on everything you need to know about IP if you want to be an entrepreneur in an IP-based business. It is not a class on how to write patents. It's about the business of intellectual property. Normally we get about 100, 150 students in it. It's zero credit. Anyone can audit it. There's no grades. There's no homework. We don't take attendance. So it's a great class to come and surf the web. In this case, because this year we're going to be virtual, we're trying an experiment, and we upped the cap to 300.
Okay.
And I will maybe I'll put the link. Anyone can register. You don't need to call me.
If you send us the link, I'll put it in a LinkedIn follow up, and I'll put it out on Twitter as well.
Great. So anyone can take the class. So that is one way we do it. I'll come back to the equity question. Basically, in all of when I joined, there's nothing wrong with this. When I joined, the university did what most universities do, which is we treat every startup. We were essentially custom negotiating every startup deal, so that all the various levers, there's a whole bunch of levers you can pull for the economics around a license agreement. Mm-hmm. There's an upfront fee. There's early year license fees. There's equity. There's anti-dilution associated with the equity. And then there's the sort of the big stuff. There's the royalties. There's the success-based milestone payments. There's minimum annual royalties. There's like dozens of different levers you can pull economically. And intellectually, the right answer is clearly you should customize every license agreement to fit that company's needs so that they're crafted perfectly and no two are alike. They're like, snowflakes. The challenge is that doesn't actually work. I don't think that works in a university environment because the faculty all talk to each other and the VCs all know each other. And so but everyone likes to brag about the part of the deal that they felt like they did well on and not talk about the parts that they didn't. So we felt like we were trying to create sort of roughly equivalent agreements. Some might have higher equity and lower royalties, but we found that people would tell their friends only about the best term they got. And that just made everyone incredibly paranoid and pissed off. Yeah. Because everyone's like, well, why are you treating that guy down the hall differently than me? So I think around 7 or 8 years ago, we went out and benchmarked off Cornell, Caltech, Stanford, MIT, Carnegie Mellon, and a bunch of others, and came up with a fairly standardized approach to startups so that all the equity gets handled the same. So I can actually talk about this very openly. In a typical faculty startup, not where it's a competitive bidding war, then all bets are off. But in a typical faculty startup, we'll take 5% equity with anti-dilution through the Series A. And that's not to the exclusion of other terms. So we have very low upfronts. We defer the patent expenses. We try to make it as low cash intensive on the company as possible so they can retain the cash they need to grow the company. And then we get market rate royalties, milestones, and everything else. And we try to treat everyone the same so we don't get people angry at us later on. And just get as many technologies out of the lab as possible, live to fight another day.
Yeah. So we had a good related question here, which is, if you do actually, because you're in basically the black swan business, right? Once you actually get an actual black swan, do you find that you get pressure from other places? It's like, this is really big. Why didn't you get more for this one? Right? Or why weren't the terms more favorable to you on this one? How is this our win, and how did you not get it now?
That is so interesting. It's a great question, right? Because you're like, you feel really good, and you like, you buy a case of champagne, and then when you wake up 3 days later, you're like in this woozy haze, and the trustees. Actually, to be honest, no, not at Columbia. I have heard that happen at many other institutions where there's, everyone thinks they know better, and so when the deal's done, nobody cares about the deals that die. It's kind of like the producers,
right?
Like, you can oversay, you can sell 150% ownership share at a show that crashes. You'd think that people would pick apart the deals and say, well, how come you didn't have more equity? How come you didn't have higher royalties? I think one of the real benefits that we have, that my team and I all benefit from at Columbia, is the faculty and the administration, and I'm going to put a big caveat of by and large here. Like
Yep,
us,
noted.
I mean, what are you gonna do? But like us and respect us. And so I think, and we've now done, as I said, the Columbia has generated over $3.5 billion of royalty income over the IP revenue over the years. We've done thousands of license agreements. We've managed 5,000 invention reports, actually over 5,000 invention reports at this point, significantly over, and 200 plus startups. At this point, we don't get a lot of second guessing. People may not like the approach that we take, and some people, there's faculty who believe it should be equity only deals. There should be no royalties or milestones. There's others that believe that we shouldn't be taking equity at all. You're not going to please everyone all the time, but by and large, I think we are blessed to have a very supportive senior administration in the president, my boss, Jerry Rosberg, the deans, the department chairs, and the vast majority of the faculty. So we don't tend to get second guessed a lot.
Yeah.
Hey, Orin, we've had a couple of other, while we're sticking with the IP topic, we've actually had a couple of other questions asking you to comment on a recent letter that 34 attorneys general sent about exercising march-in rights to basically seize a patent if government funding, had been used to support the development of that patent. In this case, it was specifically about remdesivir, the Gilead therapeutic that's being used in COVID. So, and the question is more of what potential impact, if march-in rights were started to be exercised on US held patents, would that have for your ability to do tech transfer and biotech startups?
Yeah. I'm sorry, I can't remember where the button is on Zoom to generate fake static and then hang up. Where is that?
We took it off.
Here, if you just talk, I'll mute you for a little while.
Damn it. No, that is seriously, I'm not going to give a terribly good answer to that question. I will frame it out of this is just my personal beliefs. This is a really, really complicated question that I think we as an industry, we collectively as an industry, biopharma, venture capital, patent attorneys, universities, startups, we as an industry need to figure out a way to balance a totally legitimate concern by the public about drug pricing on one hand and access to medicines, and on the other hand, creating incentives for innovators to continue to innovate. And I think it's less, I already worry about many of the changes that have happened in the patent system over the last 10 years or so from the American Invents Act and onwards, in particular inter-parties review or IPRs that allow patents that have already been issued by the USPTO to get challenged and rescinded at a very high rate. It is, the analogy I often use is, for that is, if developers were building buildings on land but the title to the underlying land could be challenged at any point in the future and ended up actually getting rescinded at something like a 30 to 50% rate, nobody would build. That would be the last building you see built. Because no one's going to buy a piece of land for $1 million, then invest $500 million building a building, and then find out later that they might not own the land. It just doesn't work. I think this is sort of a similar issue, in that, but it's much more complicated. So I'm not going to comment specifically on that. I will say this is a real challenge that we need to figure out. Most drugs that enter development fail, and only fail after very expensive R&D and very expensive clinical trials. And we can't look at only the successful ones and say, well, that pill only cost a nickel to make, so you should be able to charge 7 cents, because it's not factoring all the work that went into getting it to market and all the other drugs. But on the other hand, if we continue to have, Martin Shkreli-esque bad actors out there, and if we as an industry don't figure out a way to make this work, it is a totally unsurprising question that we're being asked.
Right. Yeah, there's a very big disconnect between the actual systematic policies that people use and what the actual patients feel in their pockets, right? So that's a lot of where the perception comes from.
Yeah, and I will say a lot of universities, I feel like we're certainly involved in this story, but our job is relatively easy in the sense that these patents the patents and the technical information and know-how that we're transferring to venture capitalists and startups and industry are the beginning of the story, but the real risk capital comes significantly afterwards. I think many of us include things like global health related clauses in our license agreements to try and make sure that the patents that our patents don't become a barrier to people getting affordable access to healthcare around the world.
Right.
But that is easy for us to say because we're just the beginning of this chain.
Yeah.
So if we think about things from the beginning of the chain, right, I want to think a little bit about company formation, because we've had a significant amount of capital being deployed. You have larger A rounds being basically announced at company formation, right? And a lot of this really is driven by kind of the VC groups or the VC syndicates themselves, right? So how is your relationship or your office's relationship with larger VC funds, changed over the last however long, right? Do you see that the relationship starts a little bit earlier in thinking about what some of their motivations are in terms of what kind of areas they're focused in, or is it really still they kind of come to you with an idea and you figure out how to work with them on an a la carte basis?
Sure. So I'm going to answer that by explaining, I'm going to use a model that I often use when I'm talking to venture capitalists that we don't know, to explain sort of how our ecosystem works. I generally think of us as having essentially 4 tiers of VCs that we work with. Oh, let me say investors that we work with. So I'll start at the most casual. So tier 1, we have about 500 investors that we work with and I say work with very lightly, so I'll put the quotes around that. We have about 500 investors that we communicate with 3 or 4 times a year. And actually, this email just went out. We have an email that goes out to this whole list 3 times a year, which says, here are 12 startups emerging from Colombia that are looking for fundraising. It's a paragraph on each one, and a little teaser, and then what they're looking for their round 4, how much they're looking to raise. And that group of 500, most of them, they're going to nibble. We'll get some nibbles. Occasionally, we'll get a bite. Somebody will actually fund a startup. But it's good to have the conversation. These are largely virtual relationships. We market widely to them, but we have very low expectations that most of them will ever actually license. Statistically, even if they are licensing, they're doing deals. Statistically, it's unlikely that they're going to do a deal with us. I've probably never met 450 of them. 500. They're just purely virtual relationships. I might have spoken to them on the phone. Tier 2 are deeper. They're deeper relationships. I would say a lot of the biopharma venture funds. I'm blanking on the term. The company corporate venture firms. Probably fall into this category. So we've got much deeper relationships with them. JJDC, Pfizer Ventures. They might serve on advisory boards. They're going to be judges for us, mentors to the teams. They'll meet more faculty. They'll give really good advice. But typically, they're still later stage. Our stuff's a little bit too early. So either they'll wait and invest later, or they'll join a syndicate, but they're unlikely to build a new co from scratch. We love them. And they're very important to our ecosystem, but we're not counting on them actually funding a deal out of Colombia anytime soon.
Or leading, per se.
Or at least leading.
Yeah.
But usually they'll come in later. They'll come in the late A, early B rounds. They're not going to come into the seed or A rounds.
Right.
The third tier are the ones you're talking about. So these are incredibly deep-pocketed and deep experience investors. Lux, Versant, TPG, Flagship, Arch, Atlas, 5AM, Polaris. That they'll sort of back the money truck up. And these will do sort of 30, 40, $50 million A rounds sometimes. Typically based on existing PI relationships or blockbuster papers. It is, at least in our experience, not always, but it is rare that we're marketing to them and they're like, wow, that's cool. Usually it's because, Adam from Lux is talking to Charles Zucker and they form Calliope. And that's awesome when that happens. It's hard for us to influence, but it's great when it happens. Those tend to be the ones you read about in the news. I would say And I mentioned this earlier, and then I've got a fourth here I'll come back to, but I mentioned this when we were chatting just before this call. But I think the best thing that we as an industry, the tech transfer industry, can do there is to try and streamline, develop relationships with those folks and streamline the interactions so that when those do happen, we can get them up and running as quickly as possible. Because those are really our straightest path towards cures.
Mm-hmm.
Like when a company like that engages around an incredibly exciting idea and they have essentially unlimited pockets and unlimited experience and unlimited connections and unlimited access to the pharma industry to take this eventually to market, that's what's going to get drugs into patients and save lives the quickest path from our perspective. So what we've done recently, I mentioned this earlier, is 6 of my equivalents from other university tech transfer offices. I'm going to forget someone and they're going to get pissed at me later, but it was Stanford, MIT, Duke, Penn, Yale, and Johns Hopkins. And then on the other side, we invited 6 of the world's largest VCs in this category. So we had Atlas, Polaris, Venrock, 5AM, RA Capital, and Osage, OUP, because they know universities so well. And we got together for 3 meetings since between March and now to try and put together some sort of standard expectations for both process improvements that TTOs and VCs can put in place to work together in a more streamlined way, and also a common set of understandings about the economics. Like, how should the term sheet be structured? What's a reasonable approach to equity? How do you handle sub-licensing? Like, there's some really tricky things in a license agreement. How do you handle know-how and technical information? How do you handle licensing future improvements? How do you handle sub-licensing? How do you handle M&A and control of patent prosecution? So we've just finished that up and we're going to be hopefully publishing those shortly so that the whole industry can benefit from them. But anyway, that's tier 3. And tier 4 is there are a handful of VC firms that are really trying to go deep in a small number of universities. And I will say this is sort of the equivalent of the biopharma experiments we talked about earlier with Takeda and BBI. But you have firms like IP Group, Osage sometimes, Kairos does a little bit of this. Does with a few schools. They're a newer fund. You also now have like Amun out of Israel is starting to do this. Deerfield here in New York, and we love the Deerfield folks. Deerfield have been doing this in a very public way with about 10 or 12 universities across the country. So we have a $130 million fund dedicated to Columbia with Deerfield. But you've seen a handful of VCs that are really willing to go early and just like essentially virtually wander the halls of the institution looking for early stage ideas, like napkin stage ideas.
Yeah.
It's early days, so we'll see if that experiment pans out. But we think it's very, very promising because by the time the blockbuster paper comes out, it's usually a bidding war.
Right.
These VCs are looking to get in earlier than that. So you read, my point is, you read more about the Calliopes and the Vors and the Prevails of the world. But we've got lots of startups that are doing exceptionally well that have raised in chunks along the way. So Applied Therapeutics, which went public, Schrodinger just went public, but that's like a 15-year-old story that's been percolating along, raising and drips, raising along the way. Forkhead Therapeutic, the Gordana, Vunjik Novakovic companies like Epibone and Tara, Darwin Therapeutics from Andrea Califano's lab. You're seeing a lot of these that are they're raising what they need, but it's not these big splashy $50 million rounds.
Right. So if we think about the way that you had mentioned this a little while ago about 5 to 7 years ago, we started to see this groundswell of more and more startup companies being formed in and around New York. And I wondered, if we look back, what were some of kind of the major things that you think contributed to that, right? I remember, you hit the nail on the head, right? Everyone always used to say, lab space funding and entrepreneurs, right? And, I think you have, the emergence of places like Launch Labs and J Labs is one. And then you have really folks like Versant and the Accelerator Corp that were really kind of the first new entrants that came in and turned over a bunch of rocks within the ecosystem.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So I mentioned this study, the what would you have to believe study. And those what would you have to believe studies, by the way, I love those at BCG because they basically were like, you came in knowing you couldn't prove anything. Like by definition, there was no right answer, because they were like, well, they're not saying like, how do we become one? They're saying, what are the elements that would sort of have to be here for us even to have a shot on goal?
Yeah.
Right.
And so, you know, if I'm flashing back to 2004, there was essentially very little or no wet lab space in New York City that was available. It was very hard to compete with the Wall Street, you know, the Wall Street companies for building out new space. The biotech incubators that did exist, and I love BioBat and Cindy Downstate. I think Eva Kramer was one of the early cheerleaders from New York and has done a great job at it. Brooklyn was not hot at the time. And so saying go all the way out to Brooklyn was hard. You know, that was problematic. It was very expensive. There was a perception, I think a reality, that there weren't these experienced entrepreneurs and biopharma executives that were in the New York region that were willing to take this kind of a risk, and it was too hard to move people here. There was a reputation, and I don't think it was deserved, but there was a reputation that tech transfer was not really evolved yet. You know, you'd hear things like arrogant, difficult to work with, greedy, slow. I don't think that was true, but what you have seen at many of the offices is that there's sort of a new generation of people who've taken over who often come from the private sector in some way or other. And also just the scale's grown. And so as the scale's grown, as these universities start doing double or triple the number of inventions and deals, they're going to have to put processes in place to make them more streamlined. So that's become easier. There wasn't really a lot of city government support prior to the Bloomberg administration. It just, nobody was out there waving the pom-pom saying this had to be, you know, the future of New York. And there wasn't a lot of local funding. And pretty much I would say all of that has changed, which is really exciting. So New York now is really almost, I mean, I'm a lifelong New Yorker. I come from, you know, I'm the child of 2 lifelong New Yorkers. I'm married to a New Yorker, raising New York kids in the public school system here. Like the city is, we'll see what happens, but the city is sort of unrecognizable from a business perspective, what it was back then. I mean, so
very much so.
And I do think it really is a team effort. I mean, there's been a lot of people. The universities in town have been amazing. The leadership of the universities. You know, I think a lot of that, the cheerleading started with Mark Tessa-Levine, I think coming from, you know, to Rockefeller and leaving for Stanford. But the deans and presidents across all the universities have really gotten behind this message. And, you know, at places like at Columbia, President Bollinger has been fantastic. The deans, Mary Boyce, the medical center, at the engineering school, but also faculty like Sam Sia, who's a serial entrepreneur, but also founded Harlem Biospace and tried to solve the wet lab problem himself.
Which in and of itself was a big deal, right? Before Harlem Biospace, there was nothing. Yeah. Launch Labs wasn't even a thought. J Labs was a dream. There was nothing before Sam put together Harlem Biospace.
And the amazing thing about Sam, I mean, he's an amazing guy, but the amazing thing, that was like his, like, not, it wasn't even his day job, his research. His night job is big companies. His other night job is like advising students as like the vice dean for entrepreneurship in the engineering school. And then on the side, he just starts to start a biotech incubator.
Yeah.
Like, who does that?
And it's funny. So when we first moved to New York, Sam was my neighbor, right? He literally lived in the apartment next door to us. And I still have no idea how he and Christine found the time to get that off the ground.
They're an amazing pair. I do think, you know, so we've also, speaking of real estate and launch labs, you know, the real estate partners willing to come in and take risks. Like, we work really closely with the Alexandria team. We think they're fantastic. A lot of our companies are in their launch lab space, and I think it's pretty.
And now you're getting one at Columbia.
And now they're building a launch labs up at Columbia across the street from the medical center. So but people willing to come in early and take big bets on that ecosystem is really important. And then you've got the you know, Maria Gotch has been working on this for like 15 years. The Partnership for New York City has been a tireless supporter. The EDC, through generations of people. I mean, Steve Strauss and Eric Gertler back in the days before Eric went to the ESD, where he's now doing the same thing for ESD, which is great. But Lindsay Harcum, Raphael, Doug Thede, Carlo Uvienko, so many people. And then the VCs, you know, the early VCs, you mentioned like Thong Lee from Accelerate Corp, but also Carlo Rizzuto and Dennis Purcell and the whole Deerfield team. Like, this has been a really concerted effort across a whole bunch of people. Surprisingly small number of people for a town this large, but just consistently pushing the ball forward over a couple of decades. It really makes a difference, as it turns out.
So, hey, let me ask you this. So we're getting that flywheel going, right? Of all of the pieces that you need for a successful ecosystem, continue building early stage companies. What do we still need? What's missing? Anything but time?
Yeah. So I'll tell you a couple. This is going to sound like an ad. It's not meant to. I think there are still some vulnerabilities to me, and they're at the earliest stage of the ecosystem. And this is not limited to New York. So I'm going to broaden the question out a little bit. But universities are very good at generating incredibly transformative potential blockbusters. But there's still this gap, the so-called valley of death,
Right.
where it's a fascinating patent or couple of patents. It's a faculty member, but they probably don't want to quit their day job and become the entrepreneur. It's a postdoc who's willing to leave, but really may not be CEO caliber material. And someone asked this question earlier. I don't think I actually addressed it. We at Columbia have launched a whole bunch of initiatives to try and support these technologies so that they can go from the lab either into industry or into a startup, but to start as strong as possible. Mm-hmm. So that they don't die in the valley.
Right.
And
right.
so, and part of that is like my colleague in our office, Dimitra Pokoko, runs what we call the Lab to Market Accelerator Network. So Columbia runs, I think we're up to 9 lab to market accelerators in different industries. So we have one in cancer, we have one in metabolic disease, we have a bunch, we have cybersecurity, and actually that one, well, it's a long story, but energy, cybersecurity, and all of these are designed to take the most promising but early stage inventions and turn them, connect them with mentors and advisors from industry, from venture capital, teach them how to pitch, teach them how to run a company, connect them with high quality entrepreneurs who might join the team and help lead it and take it forward, introduce them to VCs into industry, and really get them battle hardened and ready to go out there into the world. And we think that's been really transformative at Columbia. It's been, I don't have the stats offhand, but it's, hundreds of teams have gone through these accelerators at this point, and many of them have gone on to raise very significant rounds and are on their way towards becoming successful products in the market. But I think you're seeing more and more, this is not just us, more and more universities are doing these. And so getting a group of people who are willing to engage and support these startups by mentoring them, advising them, joining the teams, talk at these accelerators, be judges and things like that is incredibly important. Other than that, I think New York's in a pretty good place. I mean, pre-COVID, we'll see what happens now. I am always bullish, I think by temperament, but also, New York proud, but we'll see. I don't know what's going to happen next.
Well, you've nailed the segue on that one, right? So now we have COVID, and Columbia's response to COVID has been pretty incredible, right? We've seen things like David Ho pushing forward on antibody development, and so many other things behind the scenes. So you want to talk a little bit about kind of how the university community stepped up, and a little bit about how your office tried to facilitate a lot of this, because ultimately, when the university steps up, somebody somewhere has to have an agreement, right? Someone has to someone has to make sure that the actual agreements move too. So
yeah, no, it's interesting. One of the things that attracted me to the field initially, my old boss, when I joined, my boss was Mike Clear, really great guy. He'd been running the office for like 5 or 6 years, I think at that point. We went to Penn and then he retired. But he used to talk about, quote, doing God's own work. I mean, so, you can think about what we all do. I don't mean just tech transfer. I mean, the startups and the VCs and the biopharma industry, of like, when you do your job well, literally it is life-saving or life improving. Yeah. And when you do your job poorly, it's the opposite. You're actually just in the way. And that has consequences. This isn't like, a new flavor of toothpaste hitting the market 3 months later. Like, if you have a disease that kills 10,000 people a year, every month delay is 800 lives lost. Yeah. So these are, you don't get bigger consequences than this. And I think that's hugely motivating to those of us in the profession. I would say in the university world, all of us could be making more money if we were working in industry. So we've chosen to be where we are, but also for the researchers. And I think the reason I mention that is when the COVID crisis hit New York like a tidal wave, I don't think any of us really knew what to expect. I mean, no one knew what to expect. from the disease progression, certainly. Um, but but even just in terms of how this is going to play out. And so I remember that first week, everything went quiet. There was like this, like everything stopped. The calendars were cleared. The phones, the email stopped, the phone stopped, and it was just like, okay, we don't know what's going to happen. And then there was an absolute explosion of creativity around Columbia. And it started first, and actually Elizabeth Hellman, Derek's wife, was a core part of this. But
I know her.
do you know her? She's great.
I do know her.
She really
She's
is a
in the
rock
next
star.
room, actually.
She's a total rock star. But anyway, Elizabeth and a bunch of colleagues from the engineering school, Jeff Kaisar, and then some faculty from the medical center, Anil Alani and others, we started to get calls from the hospital system saying, "Hey, do you guys have any?" And then fill in almost a bewildering array of like, "Do you guys have any? We need face shields, and also, HVAC filters and thermometers. Like, can you make those?" And so we started to, I learned more about PPE and different kinds of plastics and roll-to-roll manufacturing in the month of March than I've ever known in my whole life. And so it was amazing to see the faculty across the university collaborating. So that team, they went from raw designs for face shields to products in use for patient care in 7 days. And then millions of units of these worldwide in about 2 to 3 weeks, all free via click licensing. The general counsel's office at the university, I mean, we actually have a great general counsel, and her team is amazing. But I've never seen flexibility from attorneys like this. They put together this licensing agreement that essentially was a use it, don't sue us license, is the way I described it.
Yep.
And it was up and running in like a couple of days. So, but since then, you've also seen, I'm really hopeful. Like COVID, the crisis is obviously enormously challenging and is creating budget problems we haven't even begun to get our hands around at the hospitals and universities and the cities and the schools. And that's setting aside any damage to the economy that we haven't even seen yet.
Right.
But the level of collaboration and creativity that we're seeing across labs in the university, across universities, between universities and industry, across industry. I mean, the idea that you would see these announcements coming out, the biopharma industry saying that they're going to share best practices around manufacturing vaccines, that they're going to share manufacturing capacity for therapeutic antibodies, like it's hard to imagine. And we've done a handful of these deals now. One big one that we can't announce yet, but we just signed. But the level of collaboration, the collaborative spirit, the speed these are getting done, the willingness to just bend all the rules to get the stuff into the market and try and do good for humanity it's humbling and breathtaking. And I'm hopeful that when this crisis passes, and that it does pass, that we'll remember some of these lessons and can put them into practice, in the regular deals thereafter. Because when this is all over, cancer will still exist, and so will hypertension, and so will AMD. This is what's sweeping humanity now, but we still have all the challenges we had before, and if we can apply some of these practices to those, that'd be really great.
Yeah.
Yep. I hope so. We tend to say this every single week, but the response of the industry, really from anywhere from basic science all the way through the biggest biopharma companies we have, has been amazing, both in terms of the extensive level of response and how fast everything has been.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot of things to be hopeful about. I think it's a challenge looking at the numbers every single day, but again, I think you've hit the nail on the head where we're doing a lot of things that are pretty amazing, and if we can do these now, then there's no reason for them to stop once we get things under control.
And we're thankful to you for being our guest today and for the work that you are doing and Columbia is doing to better humanity in your terms. So we very much appreciate you being our guest. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. But thank you so much. We'll definitely have you back on a future episode of our virtual breakfast series.
Thanks for having me, Derek and Jennifer. These series have been great. I really appreciate it. I've enjoyed all of them so far.
Thanks so much.
Orin, thank you so much. And thanks to everybody. Have a great day.
Bye.
Thanks.
Thank you for tuning in to New York Bio's virtual breakfast series. Join us every Tuesday at 9 a.m. for more discussions with leaders from across the healthcare spectrum. For more information on New York Bio, please visit us at www.newyorkbio.org.